Hi all, I am Dr. Naveen Sugumaran. I am an assistant professor at School of Legal Studies, Cochin University of Science and Technology. I teach family law and environmental law for undergraduate students, and I offer climate change law and governance for postgraduate students in law at the same department. So here today I am offering a MOOC course on climate change law and governance. The MOOC course is actually divided into 5 modules. The module 1 talks about the problems of climate change, module 2 talks about climate change framework, module 3 talks about the Paris Agreement and climate change, module 4 talks about India and the climate change policy, and module 5 talks about climate change litigation. So as far as climate change is concerned, we all know that climate change has been a very hotly discussed topic in the international fora. Very recently, we also know that climate change is becoming a very important topic for discussion in the academia also. So as far as climate change is concerned, we know that all forms of life on earth, from ecosystem to human civilization, is vulnerable to the changing climate. Unprecedented changes in the climate system has affected all forms of life on the earth in different parts of the world. So here we will be discussing about the problems of climate change in the module 1. We all know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has established beyond that doubt that climate change is real and is happening. And the real causes of climate change is anthropogenic. Although we know that natural factors are also responsible to climate change, we will be trying to address the problems from an anthropogenic perspective. Here in the module 1, which talks about the problems of climate change, we will be discussing about the difference of the different definitions on climate change and global warming. We will be discussing about the major causes and impacts of global warming. We will be discussing about the common concerns and the conflicting interests that prevail when it comes to addressing the problems of climate change. When this is basically concerned with the problems which the developed countries and developing countries have been facing when it comes to the negotiation table. And thereafter we will be discussing about some of the important principles that has been the underlying principle for the formation of the framework on climate change, the legal framework on climate change. In module 2, we will be starting with the climate change framework. We will be starting with the negotiations under the under the United Nations, which led to the formation of the United Nations framework on climate change. Under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, we will be discussing about the two important approaches in addressing the problems of climate change, which is mitigation and adaptation. And thereafter we will be discussing about the formation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the various procedures and processes involved in the collection of scientific data as well as its analysis. And we will be discussing about the Framework Convention on Climate Change in different perspectives, in different perspectives, in the sense that we will be discussing about the different responsibilities that has been casted upon the developed countries and the developing countries under the Framework Convention on Climate Change. For that purpose, we will be discussing about the most important principle, which is the common but differential responsibilities, and the equity principles under the which formed the basis for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And now thereafter we will be discussing about the most important legally binding document which continued after the Framework Convention on Climate Change for effective implementation of the objectives under the Framework Convention. Under the Kyoto Protocol, we will be discussing about the different mechanisms, the flexible mechanisms that were introduced under the Kyoto Protocol, that is the joint implementation, the clean development mechanism, the carbon trading, etc. So apart from these mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol, we will be also discussing about the financial and other technological support provisions that are there under the Framework Convention as well as under the Kyoto Protocol. After module 2, we will be discussing about the Paris Agreement and climate change under module 3. Here we will be discussing about the importance of Paris Agreement. We will be discussing about how we have arrived at the Paris Agreement, what all were the major points for discussion or negotiations in the formation of the Paris Agreement. And under the Paris Agreement, we will be discussing about the most important feature or the salient features of the Paris Agreement, which is the national determined contributions. So we know that it is the responsibility of every state who is a party to the Paris Agreement to submit their national determined contribution. And thereafter we will be discussing about the provisions relating to assistance and efficiency under the Paris Agreement, and we will be discussing about the transparency provisions with regard to reporting, monitoring and verification under the Paris Agreement. And we will be discussing the most important feature of the Paris Agreement, which we call the global stocktake, which will be which will involves the process of reviewing and assessment of the national determined contributions that each party submit to the Paris Agreement. So, after the Paris Agreement, we will be examining what has happened to the approach of the developed and the developing countries towards the problems, towards addressing the problems of climate change. We can see a shift from the global to the state under the Paris Agreement. You can see a shift from top-down approach to a hybrid approach under the Paris Agreement. The top-down approach is basically applied in the Kyoto Protocol, where you can see that the obligation comes from the top and the obligation was upon the developed countries alone under the Kyoto Protocol. So, when it comes to the Paris Agreement, you can see that the obligation is upon all the states, but with the rider that all the states are free to self-determine their obligations. But all these obligations are subject to a verification called the global stocktake. So, this shift from the global to the state to the domestic level can be observed under the Paris Agreement. All these things will be examined in detail under the module 3, and thereafter we will be discussing about the operating module of the Paris Agreement, which we call the Paris Rule Book, in detail. And after discussing module 3, we will move on to the module 4. Module 4 will be discussing about India and the climate change policy. There we will be discussing about what has been the approach of India towards the formation of the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the negotiations during the Kyoto Protocol, and also the negotiations that ensued after the Kyoto Protocol towards the formation of the Paris Agreement. So, India has been a major leader for the southern bloc in raising the concerns of the developing countries, as well as establishing the importance of including the provisions relating to equity and common but differential responsibilities under the various framework conventions, as well as other agreements which has been constituted under the United Nations in order to address the problems of climate change. So, apart from India's role in the negotiations for the formation of different climate agreements, we will be discussing about the most important national action policy on climate change, which was established in 2008 in India, and then thereafter we will be discussing about the various legislative and constitutional provisions that are there under the Indian laws, which can be related to addressing the problems of climate change. So, thereafter we will be discussing about the most important climate actions that India has initiated under different sectors, including the industry, the agriculture, the transport, etc. By trying to bring a major transition in its approach from the fossil fuel energy to the renewable energy. After discussing the policies of India under module 4, we will move on to the module 5, where we will be discussing about the climate change litigation. So, we will be discussing about the emerging trends that is happening in the climate litigation. We will be discussing about the overall global trend towards addressing the problems of climate change in a strategic form, as well as in other individual or in a peripheral perspective. So, here we will be discussing about how the litigants are approaching before the different forums in order to address or raise concerns about the problems associated with climate change. So, there are claims based upon the right approach. There are claims based upon private rights, private laws. There are claims based upon corporate accountability. You can find claims based upon compensations. So, the different types of litigations have been coming up before different forums across the globe. Basically, the litigations initially started with litigations against the fossil fuel industries or corporations, but now we can see that there is a gradual shift or gradual expansion of the litigations from fossil fuel industries to those corporates involved in transport, agriculture, food, trade, industry. So, there is a consciousness among arising consciousness among the people or the civil society as to the importance of preventing the factors that are responsible for climate change, and making the government as well as the private entities responsible for their actions as well as inactions that has resulted in climate change. So, here apart from the different global initiatives, climate litigations at the global level, we have the module also focuses upon the climate litigations that are happening in India also. So, here as far as India is concerned, we know that the litigations are only in a very nascent stage, but still we can see litigations coming from different parts of India are trying to address the problems of climate change, either either from as a central issue as well as a peripheral or incidental issue. So here the most important factor, another important most important factor that is also addressed in this particular chapter is the need for bringing climate consciousness among the people as well as the judiciary. So with this all these provisions, all these modules, we will be concluding this particular course, MOOC course on climate change law and governance. Hope all will be enjoying this particular course and getting the maximum benefit out of this particular MOOC course. As far as climate change is concerned, even the international organizations as well as the Framework Convention on Climate Change is also talking about the importance of imparting knowledge about the need for addressing the problems of climate change. So from that perspective also, this course will be of great benefit to the people as well as the society in understanding the problems, the causes, impacts and the rules and regulations that are related to addressing the problems of climate change. Thank you.